All right, I think we might kick off while people are joining. Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar Understanding the Waragul, Waragul being the Ngunnawal word for dingo. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Emily, I'm the Policy and Advocacy Officer here at the ACT Conservation Council. I'm also joined by our Executive Director, Dr. Simon Copland. On behalf of the Conservation Council, I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Ngunnawal, Ngambri and Ngarigo peoples as the traditional custodians on the land in which we live and work here in the ACT, and extend respect to all other First Nations people with connection to this region. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and we acknowledge that sovereignty is never ceded and that we benefit from stolen country. We also recognise the deep and continuing connection that First Nations people have with land, sea, culture and community. We're striving to stand in allyship with First Nations communities for self-determination and environmental justice. So for those joining one of our webinars for the first time, welcome. The Conservation Council is the peak body for environment and climate groups here in the ACT region. So we're a non-for-profit, non-government organisation representing more than 50 member groups. We're also a member of the Dingo 2030 Network, which is a coalition of scientists, conservation advocates and Indigenous organisations whose mission is to align policy with science and ensure dingoes thrive in protected areas. For some local context, the ACT Conservation Council, we also sit on the ACT Government's recently established Consultative Committee for Dingo Management. So this group's chaired by the ACT Conservator of Flora and Fauna and includes representatives from the ACT and New South Wales government agencies, traditional custodians, conservation and animal welfare organisations, scientific experts and rural stakeholders to inform policy reform about the management of Waragul here in the ACT. As you might be aware, the ACT Government has recently committed to remove the listing of wild dogs as a pest under the Pest and Laws Declaration and to recognise dingoes as a native species. So I'm really excited to be joined by our two speakers here today, Dr. Kylie Cairns and James Vandersteen from the University of New South Wales. Welcome to you both and thanks so much for joining us. As a brief introduction to our speakers, Kylie is a postdoctoral researcher at UNSW, specialising in wildlife genetics and conservation biology. Her groundbreaking work focuses on the genetic makeup of dingoes, investigating their evolutionary history and the ecological role in Australia. Dr. Cairns has contributed significantly to understanding the origins and identity of dingoes and their relationships to domestic dogs and wolves. More recently, she's begun using environmental DNA to investigate how predators interact with their environment and other species. Her research aims to inform conservation strategies that protect these iconic animals while balancing ecosystem health, biodiversity, and agricultural impacts. And James is a PhD candidate at UNSW investigating the roles of dingoes as apex predators in the Australian Alps. Specifically, how dingoes influence trophic interactions across multiple levels, from mesopredators to small mammals, from grazers to vegetation, to better understand the dingo's role in maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem function. And James's work is carried out in the ACT's Namadgi National Park, and his findings will directly inform best practice evidence-based dingo management. So just some housekeeping for the webinar. Each of our speakers will present for around 20 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. So please put your questions into the chat as they come to mind. Awesome. So I'll now hand over to Kylie.
Great. All right. So everyone can see my screen? Yes? Great. Yes. So I am going to talk a little bit about unraveling the wild dog myth and exploring Waragul or dingo identity and historic integration with genetics around Australia. So first off, before I start talking about the genetics of dingoes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what dingoes are so that you can understand why I'm so interested in these animals. So they are a social and cooperatively breeding canid, and which means that they breed two adults, a male and a female, and they raise pups together cooperatively. So both parents are involved in raising those pups. They also have strict seasonal breeding, and pups in Australia are born during the winter, around about May to August. They're also Australia's largest terrestrial carnivore on the mainland. Which means that they play a really important role in ecosystem function, as James will talk about later. They're also culturally significant for many First Nations Australian peoples. They feature as a part of songlines and dreaming stories. They also are a totem or kin animal for many peoples, and they feature heavily in rock art. As a wild lineage, dingoes are also distinct from domestic dogs because they're not reliant on humans for their resources. So they live across many different parts of Australia in harsh landscapes ranging from the tropics to the arid zone to temperate and alpine areas. However, they can also be successful on the fringes of human settlement, and some dingoes do live with people today, just as dingoes live with Indigenous peoples as a companion animal for the last few thousand years. And dingoes are broadly distributed across Australia except for Tasmania. So this is a map that basically shows the presence of dingoes across Australia, with the darker colours indicating places where dingoes are present normally, and the lighter colours indicating places where dingoes are present, but perhaps at low densities or low amounts due to lethal control, either historically or currently. And white places indicate areas where dingoes used to be present but are now extinct or suppressed to basically nil. And dingoes have been in Australia for at least about 5,000 years, and they've been a distinct lineage, different from domestic dogs and wolves, for about 11,000 years. So they are a really old basal or distinctive type of dog that split off before human domestication really started shaping dogs into the pets that we have today. And importantly, they're recognised as native Australian wildlife in most jurisdictions across Australia, but they're also heavily managed as an agricultural pest because of their impact on livestock, particularly on sheep. And what about wild dogs? So a lot of people don't understand this terminology, and so I'm going to explain it to you. So in many Australian states, the term wild dog is used to refer to dingoes, lumping them with feral domestic dogs and the hybrid descendants of those. And I think it's really important to understand that when we use that term wild dog, we are talking about dingoes, and that most policies across Australia do not distinguish between dingoes as a native canid and feral or stray domestic dogs as an exotic canid. And I think that's important because when we look at the genetic relationships between wolves, domestic dogs, and dingoes, as we can see in this figure, with the domestic dogs in the bluey purple colours and the dingoes in the orangey yellowy colours and wolves in black, we can see that genetically dingoes are very different from domesticated dogs as well as from other wolves. And so it's important that when we're talking about the animals and that we're managing in the landscape, we understand what animals we're managing. And it's very clear when we look genetically that dingoes are different from domesticated dogs. So some of the key things that threaten dingoes in Australia, at least from the perspective of a scientist, as well as looking back in history, the things that we think have threatened dingoes are hybridization with domesticated dogs, and that's basically breeding between dingoes and dogs, and then the flow of DNA from domestic dogs into the broader dingo gene pool, as well as culling due to conflict with livestock. So here is a map that shows an area near where I live, so Sydney, and this is a national park in the Blue Mountains. And you can see the purple and the red lines, which are aerial baiting transects in the national park targeting dingoes or foxes. So the red is foxes and the purple is wild dogs or dingoes. And I think that it's important to think about this perspective because lethal control is likely to be a key threat to dingoes in national parks. And as we can see from this map, it does extend quite far into many national park regions. Private landholders also carry out significant amounts of baiting on their land, as well as trapping and shooting to manage the impacts on livestock production. And science looking at the effect of baiting has shown that baiting programs in national parks or, large landscapes can kill up to 90% of the dingo population in an area. And this sort of process is likely driving dingoes to be rare or absent across large parts of Australia. So earlier studies looking at the identity of dingoes using skull morphology or microsatellites, which is an earlier type of DNA technology, suggested that hybridization was really common. So this is a map that looks at the genetic purity or amount of dingo ancestry in wild dogs across Australia. It came from the results of an extensive study by Danielle Stevens at the Invasive Animals CRC. And she tested thousands of animals across Australia. And as you can see, it suggested that hybridization was really common or widespread in southeastern Australia, as represented by the cool or bluer colours. And this sort of work led to the idea that dingoes were basically being genetically swamped or replaced by hybrids and feral dogs. And so this is where concern about hybridization and its impacts on dingoes really arose in the early 2000s, as well as earlier on from the skull morphology work in the 1970s and 80s. And this sort of work suggested that in southeastern Australia, only 1% of the dingo population was free from recent domestic dog ancestry. So there was a real concern that dingoes were being replaced. But a key finding of this work, led by Danielle Stevens, but also later, reported by myself when I looked at this data sets as well, is that feral dogs are really rare across Australia. So between the two studies, we looked at over 5,000 wild canids across Australia, and only 31 of them were feral dogs, so the blue dots, and only 27 were first-generation dingo dog hybrids, shown by the green dots. And so what this is really telling us is that there's no evidence that domestic dogs have established a wild population in Australia, and that the domestic dogs that we do occasionally detect in genetic surveys are more likely to be evidence of stray or escaped pet animals, and they're not reproducing and breeding in the wild. Oops. So more advanced DNA testing, like the work that I've carried out in the last decade, has really found that hybridization is much less common than what we thought. So this is a map that looks at the DNA testing results of about 750 animals across Australia. And the red indicates animals that have no evidence of recent dog ancestry, so within about the last 10 generations. And the orange colours indicate decreasing amounts of dingo ancestry. But what's really interesting is that out of this 750 animals, only about 16% were estimated to have less than 80% dingo ancestry. So whilst there is some evidence of hybridization, it's not as widespread as what we once thought. And far more of the wild dingoes are more dingo than we would have thought from previous work. In particular, I looked at about 50 animals from the ACT and the local region surrounding from New South Wales. And from those 50 animals, we found 2 animals that had dog ancestry in about 5 or 6 generations ago, 47 that had none in the last 10 generations, and we found 1 stray dog in that sample set. Interestingly, that stray dog did have some dingo ancestry, but it was non-local. So again, that's suggesting that the animal was not the result of breeding of dogs in the wild, but more likely an escaped pet that unfortunately found its way into a trap. But I'm talking a lot about recent hybridization and really looking at the last 10 generations. And so when scientists like myself and others have used ancient DNA from dingoes from about 2,000 years ago as a baseline, we're starting to detect chunks of dog DNA in many southeastern dingo populations across Australia. And that's telling us that there has been some hybridization in the past, and then dog ancestry is being retained in the dingo populations that we have today. So this is a figure that looks at the genome of a particular animal, with the blue bits indicating bits of DNA that look like dingo, and the yellow being bits that look dog-like. And so you can see that there's lots of blue, but there's also lots of little chunks of yellow. And that is indicating that these little chunks of dog DNA probably came from past generations. So something that happened more than 10 generations in the past. However, we're still kind of figuring out the best way to detect and estimate how much dog ancestry is present in dingoes. So that little red box that I have on the figure, that shows a region of DNA that some studies think are from hybridization from dogs, and other studies suggest is actually shared ancestral variation. So a DNA region that was present in dingoes and shared with the ancestors of dogs. And that's why it looks similar as opposed to coming from recent hybridization. So I think that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done by scientists to be able to really robustly and accurately detect the amount of hybridization. However, what all of the science is showing is that any hybridization that we are detecting, most of the dog ancestry in dingoes today is largely historic. And indeed, when we look at modeling that sort of estimates the timing of when the dog ancestry entered the dingo population, we can see a peak for a lot of hybridization happening before 20 generations ago. And a strong peak around 22 generations ago. Really interestingly, so this is the timing of introgression in a bunch of samples from New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT. And what you can see is that there are very few animals that have evidence of introgression or hybridization more recently than 10 generations ago. So that's telling us that, the previous work that was done by myself and others looking at the prevalence of hybridization and finding that it was quite uncommon is consistent with this work. So there's really not a lot of interbreeding happening between dingoes and dogs in the recent time frame. But if you look further back, there has been a peak. And what's interesting about the timing of that peak is that it coincides with the intensification of broad-scale poison baiting, particularly 1080 baiting, that really started increasingly being rolled out, particularly around national parks, around about the 1980s. Also, there were bounties that were happening particularly earlier on in our history, in the 1800s to the 1930s, which resulted in major suppression of dingo populations. And I think it's important also to consider what's happened more recently in Australia in terms of dog ownership. So it's likely that the way that people have been keeping our pet dogs, and we're being more responsible about how we're doing that and keeping them indoors more or not letting them roam as much. We're also desexing them more frequently. That also is probably inhibiting the amount of dingo dog hybridization that's happening across Australia as well. And why would we be interested in the timing of when hybridization happened, and why do we think that it's controlled with lethal, it's associated with lethal control? That's because lethal control is known to be a driver of hybridization in other wild canids, like coyotes and red wolves and grey wolves. And so we know that in cooperatively breeding canids, where there's a social structure in their family groups and they maintain a territory, that when we use poison baiting or intensive lethal control and disrupt that might influence hybridization, and it might also influence other things to do with their behavior. So importantly, this is a figure that's looking at the genetic relationship or differentiation between dingoes and dogs, shown in the orange circle and the blue circle. What we see is that despite the fact that there has been some historic integration or hybridization in the past, dingoes are still maintaining a distinct genetic identity separate from domesticated dogs. And so I think that that's important because we should think about the fact that morphology and seasonal breeding is really strongly conserved in wild dingoes even now, and they're maintaining that distinct genetic identity. And so it's suggesting that dingoes need to be genetically mostly dingo to be successful in Australian environments. And therefore, if you're thinking that, mostly dingoes are not breeding with domesticated dogs in the recent time frame, and that it's largely a historic problem, that means that our focus in terms of conserving dingoes should be on retaining historic diversity that's present at the moment, as well as evolutionary potential, so genetic diversity and those sorts of things. We also want to act to prevent further hybridization. So we don't want hybridization to increase, but nor do we need that to be the main focus of our conservation programs, as we can already see that it's quite uncommon. But we need to also make sure that we are maintaining dingo populations that are large enough that they can purge or get rid of genetic ancestry from dogs if they can. And I just want to point out before I continue that, historically people have thought that pelage or coat color was something that you could use to identify dingo hybrids. But scientific studies in the last few years have really shown that coat color is not a reliable indicator of recent dog ancestry. So most people think that a dingo looks like, that typical ginger animal to the left. But if we look at museum specimens as well as dingoes that have been DNA tested as having no recent dog ancestry, we can see that dingoes actually can come in a wide variety of colors, including black and tan, black and white, black, white, sable, so that's ginger with black hairs along the spine, as well as piebald, which is like that white color with patches of ginger or black on them. And so really what this research is showing is that dingoes with odd coloration, that odd coloration may well have come originally from dogs, or it could be ancestral, but it's not an indication of how much dingo ancestry an animal has. And so we need to look beyond the coat color when we're looking at wild animals. And the problem with lethal control for conservation is largely that it impacts on reproduction as well as the demography or mate availability of the population. So if you kill a significant amount of the population, then that's going to reduce the availability of other dingo mates. It's also going to change the density of dingoes across the landscape. It's going to make it more likely for animals to move in and out of different territories. And so that can increase the risk of hybridization, as I've already said. It can also increase the spread of dog DNA across the population. And it can lead to bottlenecks, which can result in inbreeding and genetic decline at a local level. So this is a map from the Dingo 2030 network looking at aerial and ground baiting in national parks in New South Wales, with the red and the black showing baiting. And I've also got a figure there looking at the number of dingoes trapped and killed in the ACT by year. And you can see that it seems relatively modest, like 30 on average, somewhere between 30 and 40 to 50 on average per year. But I guess you need to put that into relative perspective about how many dingoes are in the landscape. And I think James will talk a little bit about that potentially. And I think it's important for land managers and decision makers to consider the fact that lethal control is likely having a significant impact on the genetic viability of dingo populations, and that the impact does not extends further than just, I killed X number of animals, but the population increased the next year, so it was fine. We know that these sorts of culling programs can have a real big impact on animal populations. And I'm just going to finish up here with the fact that there has been some recent scientific work carried out by Andrew Weeks and Colin Ahern's, which is in review at the moment. And what we're seeing is that there's evidence of genetic decline in many of the southeastern dingo populations. So this is a figure that looks at FRO, which is just a measure of inbreeding or, homozygosity. And you can see that the ACT dingo population, which is this one of the bars in yellow, has quite a high elevated levels of inbreeding, quite similar nearly the highest levels seen outside of the West Victorian dingo population. And so that's it could be considered to be quite concerning. And we know that this sort of level of inbreeding may be inhibiting the purging of historic dog ancestry in dingo populations. And it could also be a reason why dingoes are retaining or keeping some of that dog ancestry. If dingoes, as we can see, they all really have high levels of inbreeding compared to the dogs, which is that grey bar down the bottom. They could be selectively keeping bits of dog ancestry or bits of dog DNA in their genome because those bits are providing important genetic diversity that they otherwise would lack. And finally, so some of the key take-home messages from my talk are that dingoes are distinct from domesticated dogs. There's no evidence of a feral or wild dog population in Australia, and dingo-dog hybrids are rare. And I think I just want to highlight that terminology is really important. It's important in policy that we distinguish between dingoes and feral dogs, and we shouldn't treat them as the same in policy and management. Most dingoes carry no recent domestic dog ancestry, but there has been some historic gene flow peaking in about the 1960s to the 1980s. And genetic decline is a really serious concern for dingoes across the landscape. And just thanks to some of my collaborators. Take it away, James.
Cool. Thanks, Kylie. All right, can everyone see that? Cool. All right, so check. Yep, cool. So for my PhD, I'm looking at dingoes and their role as apex predators in the ACT, and specifically in the Namadgi National Park, and how they structure and regulate that alpine montane ecosystem. And for this research, I'm supervised by Mike Letnick, Neil Jordan, and Renee Bruata. So first, a bit of background and context. In Australia, dingoes are the terrestrial apex predator, which means they're the largest and most competitively dominant predator within their ecosystems, much like tigers, crocodiles, lions, sharks, or wolves are in their respective ecosystems. Apex predators are commonly credited with keeping ecosystems balanced and in check. One way by which they can do this is through what we call trophic cascades. So a trophic cascade is essentially just a chain of interactions that cascades through a food web, and they often begin at the top of a food web or a food pyramid, however you want to see it, and then they cascade down through the various trophic levels. So a classic example of this involves otters, sea urchins, and kelp in the Pacific Northwest of the US. When sea otters are present, they eat the sea urchins. So by keeping the urchins under control, the otters allow the kelp forests to thrive. But when the otters are absent, urchin numbers then explode and they overgraze the kelp, stripping the entire forest and leaving behind what's called an urchin barren. So we can see by just having one predator within the ecosystem, it can shape the food web and how the ecosystem functions. So now let's bring this back to dingoes. Here we have a classic Australian food web with the different trophic levels. Dingoes, as the apex predator, have the capacity to affect all levels of this food web via these kind of cascading effects that I've just outlined. For example, by directly predating on kangaroos, dingoes could indirectly benefit vegetation by reducing grazing pressure. And that's just one way via which dingoes could regulate the ecosystem. Now, cascades such as this and others within different food webs can get complicated very quickly when we start to consider all the ecosystem, environmental, and human factors at play. And I think this sort of food web, this marine food web here, sort of illustrates that well. There's just all kinds of interactions going on throughout the ecosystem. So this is what I'm sort of trying to unravel for my PhD, to get understanding of the dingo's role in Namadgi National Park and how exactly this ecosystem functions with them as their apex predator. Today I'll be focusing on one aspect of this food web, which I've presented a few times in ACT this year, so apologies for anyone that's already seen it. Hopefully you'll learn something new if you've seen it already. But today we'll be looking at specifically the interactions between dingoes and feral cats and red foxes. And I think it's a really cool interaction pathway we have here that we'll look at today. So within this little area here, dingoes, like I said, they're the apex predator, but foxes and cats are what we consider as mesopredators, which means they're basically a lower ranking predator within the ecosystem. So relationships between apex predators and mesopredators are often considered particularly strong because such species compete for prey species and just basically have a mutual dislike for one another. Basically, the big predators, the apex predators, don't really like having the small predators around. These interactions are characterized by a key ecological theory, which is called mesopredator release hypothesis. And this basically suggests that mesopredator populations will respond inversely to apex predator populations, because the apex predators will either competitively kill or exclude the lower ranking predators within the ecosystem. So for example, in the United States, coyotes are suppressed by wolves, the apex predator, with which coyotes share much of the same space and food resources. And this has been demonstrated to in turn allow fox numbers to increase, as they are now unconstrained by their most dominant competitor, the coyote, which was previously more abundant without the wolves around. So in Australia, given the predator assemblage that we have, we would expect that dingoes should suppress foxes and cats, and that fox may also potentially suppress feral cats because they're a bigger predator than the cat. So what we have here is what we call a tripartite predator assemblage, where each predator may interact with one another. This is one of the key relationships that I've been looking at in Namadgi, and so that's what we're going to get into today. So for anyone not familiar with Namadgi Park, I'm sure most of you are, it basically encompasses this bottom half of the ACT. Within Namadgi, I've been working across these four grassy montane valleys, which are surrounded by alpine and montane forests. Within each valley site, I've deployed a camera trap monitoring array to monitor the dingoes, red foxes, and feral cats, as well as other wildlife species which are relevant to my broader PhD. But today, we're just focusing on dingoes, foxes, and cats. So here we just have a few examples of some of the cool images of the dingoes that the camera traps have captured. So here, like Kylie said before, this is what we would consider, I guess, historically as a classic looking dingo, but we also have plenty more variation in the coat color for the dingoes in Namadgi. So here we have a black and white one. These guys, this pack here, white with predominantly brown patches. Black one. We got a nice classic tam on there with a big winter coat on in the snow. And of course, we also get heaps of pictures of little pups in spring when they come out, start venturing out of the dens. And here we have another couple following mum. And some more having a look around. Aside from capturing these images of the dingoes, these camera traps allow us to look at the populations of each of the predators and their activity levels. So the graph we have here is dingo activity at each of those four sites that I showed you on the map before. The y-axis here represents the number of dingo detections per 100 camera trap nights. So for example, at Bobian, which is this bar here, For every 100 nights a camera trap was active, it captured a dingo roughly 5 times. So 5 nights out of the 100 nights. But really the key takeaway of this graph here for my research is that we had sites where we had relatively high dingo activity, and we had sites where we had relatively low dingo activity. And this was useful because it allowed us to investigate how red foxes and feral cats respond to different levels of dingo activity between these sites. So that being said, here we have fox activity. And we can already see, like the theory that I described before, the mesopredator release, that fox activity is substantially lower at the 2 sites where dingo activity was high, and then where dingo activity was low, fox activity is quite high. And this suggests that fox activity may be suppressed by dingo activity. And if we look at this in a bit more detail, we can see exactly how the foxes are responding to the dingoes. The graph on the left shows the daily activity patterns of dingoes and foxes. And basically, it's just showing when they are most and least active throughout a day. Whilst the graph on the right shows us how different the patterns of the dingo and the red fox are, and whether or not that difference is meaningful. So starting with the left plot, fox activity, we can see clearly shifted away from dingo activity. You can also see that red foxes are mostly nocturnal, active during the nighttime hours. But we can see that the fox activity drops off just before that peak in dingo activity in the morning, and then picks up again after that peak in dingo activity in the early evening. Now, this pattern alone doesn't necessarily prove that dingoes are causing this shift in red foxes, because that red fox pattern is quite distinctive of a nocturnal species. But the graph on the right here does sort of strengthen the idea that the dingoes might be having an impact on how the foxes are active throughout the day. So we can see that across all sites, there is a significant difference, a meaningful difference between the activity levels of dingoes and foxes, but that difference is much stronger at the sites where there are lots of dingoes, high activity, dingo activity. Whereas where there's not much dingo activity, that difference between the dingo and the red fox activity is much smaller. So this suggests the foxes may be adjusting when they're active to avoid dingoes when the dingo activity, especially when the dingo activity is high. So together, these findings suggest that high dingo activity suppresses overall fox activity, but foxes may be able to coexist with the dingoes by shifting when they're active to avoid potential confrontation with the more dominant dingoes. And now we'll look at how feral cats fit into this picture. So overall, cat activity was quite low compared to fox and dingo activity, but it did sort of seem to mirror that of foxes, whereby cat activity was lower at the higher dingo activity sites, but slightly higher at the low dingo activity sites. But when we look at this through the daily activity patterns like we did before, although cat activity sort of drops off around the time of the morning peak in dingo activity, it largely overlaps throughout the rest of the day and night. And the graph on the right sort of reflects this mixed pattern, with only 2 of the 4 sites showing a meaningful difference between their activity patterns, that being these blue ones here. But each bar is representative of a site in a high dingo activity site and a low dingo activity site. So overall, there's not really a clear link between dingo activity levels and whether this affects cats' activity levels. Any differences we are seeing are probably just site-specific and not really being driven by dingoes. So that got us thinking, if cats are responding to pressure from overall dingo activity, as this plot might suggest, we can see they're all almost opposite. Cats go up that way, dingoes go down that way. How do cats coexist with dingoes at sites where dingo activity is high if they're not shifting their daily activity patterns? So for this, we looked at habitat use by the feral cats. And what we can see here is that at the sites with high dingo activity, this is these 2 plots here, cats tended to be detected by the cameras much more often in the closed forested habitat When we compare that to the edge habitat, which is the habitat between the forest and the open grassland, and then when we compare that to the grassland habitat, where they were almost never detected by the camera traps in the open grassland. This contrasts with the two sites of low dingo activity. And we can see in the low dingo activity sites, the feral cats were much more active consistently across all habitat types. So this basically says that when there's a lot of dingoes, cats want to be in the sheltered habitat where if they feel threatened, they can run up a tree. But when there's not so much dingo activity, the cats are much more happy to venture out into that open habitat and use it more often. Lastly, we looked for any potential relationship between the foxes and the cats. Although the fox and cat activity overlapped, there was a sort of separation here in the early morning, but they overlined quite a fair bit in the evening. But the graph on the right captures this subtle separation a little bit more, showing that differences in fox and cat activity were strongest at sites where fox activity was high. So if you remember, this is the high fox activity sites, which also is the low dingo sites. And at those sites, cat and fox activity was meaningfully different across the daytime compared to the sites where there wasn't many foxes. The cats didn't seem to want to avoid the foxes at those sites. So cats weren't consistently avoiding foxes in time, but they do when fox pressure is strong and fox activity is high. So bringing this all together, dingoes suppress both fox and cat activity. Foxes respond to this quite consistently. They shift when they're active to avoid dingoes, and this shift is strongest where dingo activity is highest. Cats, on the other hand, are a bit more flexible because they have to compete with both dingoes and foxes. Instead, they have a behavior that depends on which predator is the greatest threat locally. So when the dingo activity was high and the fox activity was correspondingly low, cats mainly had to avoid dingoes by using more sheltered, forested habitats. But when the dingo activity was low and the fox activity was high, cats shifted their timing instead, avoiding foxes, the now more dominant predator. So if dingoes are absent from the ecosystem, we'd expect that fox activity would increase and spread across more of the daytime, potentially, into those daytime hours. And in that situation, cats may use open habitats more freely because they're happy to be out in that open habitat that isn't so safe because there's not so many dingoes. But at the same time, they might move their daily activity patterns to avoid those of foxes, who are much more abundant now that there are no dingoes in the landscape. So what does this mean, and why does it matter? So in Australia, these kind of findings are quite important because both foxes and feral cats have major impacts on our native wildlife and prey species. If dingoes can help to keep these introduced predators in check, either by reducing their numbers or changing the way they behave and move and spend time out in the ecosystem, then they could play an important role in protecting native species. So understanding these interactions between dingoes and these introduced harmful mesopredators isn't just academic, it has real implications for biodiversity, especially given Australia's current extinction crisis. And so today we've covered just one aspect via which dingoes structure ecosystems and could beneficially benefit Australian biodiversity. And I'll have, I'm sure, many more talks to come as I progress my chapters of my thesis for my PhD. And if things weren't already complicated enough, dingoes might not even be the apex predator. As this image I have from Nuragi shows, there's a wedge-tailed eagle swooping this dingo down here who seems to be quite scared. So maybe I've got it all wrong, but we're planning to do some more work into the future on these kind of things and looking at some forms of non-lethal dingo management and how that might be applied for in these kind of landscapes. So if you're interested in contributing to this future research, you can donate via this QR code here on the left. That's all. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, James and Kylie. We've got about 15 minutes left for questions. So just encourage everyone to pop your questions into the chat. And I think now I'll hand over to Simon to start asking some of them.
Great. Thank you, Kylie and James. I'm going to ask, I've got a few good questions coming through. I want to ask about the ACT to start off with. So we had a question from Patrick about whether we have any data about population figures in the ACT and whether there's any information about what the population looks like here.
Yeah, I can answer that. So I've got estimates from my research in those valleys specifically. So the sort of holy grail for population estimates that everyone sort of strives towards in ecology is what we call density, which is basically you're going to give a number of dingoes per kilometre squared generally. And in the highest density I got across those sites was about 0.3 dingoes per kilometre squared. Now that is a number that doesn't really mean much. It's a bit confusing because how can you have a third of a dingo per kilometre squared? But once we extrapolate that out to a valley, for anyone that's familiar with those valleys in Namadgi, that equates to roughly anywhere between 30 and 50 dingoes within those valleys. But that becomes complicated to extrapolate out to Namadgi more broadly because I have been working specifically within those valley ecosystems. I do have cameras in the forest surrounding, but we're not entirely sure how they move through those more forested areas and how they move. And we think they're probably more in those valleys because potentially easier hunting opportunities. It's easier to see those kangaroos and chase them down than it might be in the more forested environment. But yeah, like I said, that's the kind of numbers you'd be working with in those valleys. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower, and it can fluctuate across the years for sure. But you can't really extrapolate it out to Namadgi as a broader number. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, there's a question about genetic decline that I'll get to in a second. But do we have so I think that Patrick said that if that's per valley, there's potentially 200 to 300 animals. You said it's hard to extrapolate to the whole of Namadgi. But do we have a sense of what a viable population is that can stop the genetic decline that you were potentially talking about, Kylie? Like, has there been any work on what kind of numbers we need in this area?
Yeah, so I think that's a really complicated question because I think the genetic decline is probably caused by multiple different things. So as you could see from one of those figures I shared, like all of the dingo populations have quite high levels of inbreeding. And that's not just because of things that are going on post-European colonization, but also because of the fact that when dingoes first came to Australia, there probably wouldn't have been a huge population. And so then they've all increased from that. So there's sort of a two-factor issue that we've got going on is they were already kind of inbred. The population was increasing and over time their diversity would have increased and they would have become more stable. But then post-colonization, we've been really good at suppressing dingo populations across large parts of Australia. And so that's then having an impact where it's compounding on this low genetic diversity. So it's not as simple as, oh, well, we can just put X number of animals in and that will then fix the problem. And I think also when you then think about the fact that, well, some of the dingo populations have some amount of dog hybridization in them, and they might actually be keeping some of those dog regions because of improving their genetic diversity, it becomes a really complicated question of like, how do we fix this issue? I think at the most basic level, some of the scientific studies have suggested really what we need to be doing is focusing on making sure that dingo populations are robust and they have enough animals. That means reducing the amount of lethal control in conservation areas where dingoes can be dingoes. and that we want to avoid creating like islands of dingoes. So we want to make sure that there's movement and pathways for dingoes to get from different conservation areas so that they can exchange genetic material, so that we don't just have what's happening in Western Victoria happening in different places around Australia, where basically there's an island of dingoes in Western Victoria. And it's an island because dingoes are extinct from all around them in the landscape, so they can't breed with anything else. So I hope that answers a little bit.
It does. I think that kind of goes to the question that we was going to ask you next, which is from Antia, which was really what can we do to reduce the genetic decline in populations such as in the ACT? And this, I think you've already answered this somewhat, which is how important is the size of conservation areas and connectivity across the landscape. So have you got anything else to expand on what you've just said about how we reduce that genetic decline?
Yeah, so I think it's really about making sure that we're managing dingo populations. So we're being aware of the impacts that lethal control can have on them. So for example, if we understand that an aerial baiting program could kill, 50 to 90% of the dingo population in an area, that's really significant. And if we're doing that on a yearly basis, like that's a serious problem for the genetic diversity of any animal population, really. So it means that we might need to be shifting the way that we're doing lethal control, perhaps moving towards non-lethal methods of managing their impacts on livestock, as well as, if we're going to use lethal control, trying to target problem animals as opposed to blanket suppression of a population, making sure that we have areas in the landscape, particularly like national parks, where dingoes can be present in normal densities without lethal control, and also trying to maintain corridors where dingoes can move between areas. And in some populations, we might need to move towards exploring translocation, but that's quite a fraught topic. Nobody likes the idea of trapping dingoes and then releasing them at all. So, but that's something that we're going to have to explore for some dingo populations if their genetic diversity just gets too low.
Another question about sort of populations from Nikki, which is just around, do you have a home range estimate for dingoes, like how far they spread, I guess, around from their homes?
Yeah, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I can get it across. I think if you're somewhat familiar with Namadgi, or if anyone can pull up Namadgi on their map whilst I say this. But in those valleys that I was looking at, anyone familiar, they're not very far apart, those valleys. You could easily walk from one to the other in a day or less, much less, sometimes a couple of hours if you wanted to. I never detected a dingo in more than one valley. If I detected a dingo in the big central Gudgeonby Valley in the middle, that's the only place I'd ever detect it. Same goes for Bobian and same goes for Rural Valley. They were never detected across valleys. So their home ranges in Namadgi are quite small. For instance, I had one pack in, there's numerous packs in Gudgeonby, but they seem to stick to their own little areas. Yes, they'll spread out and move around, quite often, and individuals as they grow up will sometimes be sort of ejected out or go out to find their own pack or own area. But as far as dingo home ranges go compared to other places in Australia, they're very small. But that makes sense in Namadgi because it's a resource-rich place. I'm sure everyone knows in the ACT, there's bloody kangaroos everywhere, and wallabies, so there's just food everywhere. There's water. A dingo doesn't need to move very far to go and find some food. It doesn't need to go far to find some water. It can stay in a small little place quite happily. And that contrasts to some of the desert areas where dingoes are roaming for hundreds of kilometers looking for resources. So yeah, they're quite small home ranges in Namadgi. And I think that, the fact I didn't ever see an individual moving between valleys illustrates that quite well, because those valleys are not separated. A dingo could easily walk from one to the other, even probably from the bottom one to the top one in a day if it really wanted to. So yeah.
Okay, we've only got, I think, 5 minutes left, and I want to ask a couple of policy related questions. We had, and sorry if I am not going to get to all of your questions, we've had a couple of questions about landholders, and I guess the one that's just come from Nikki, I think, is a summary of that, is that do you think there's an appetite to change attitudes amongst livestock managers to facilitate corridor movement or other management approaches?
Kylie seems well equipped to answer these questions, I think.
Look, I think that there are land managers or land holders in some areas that have appetite for those sorts of questions, but it's a shift that's needing to happen on a larger scale, probably. I think that there's a lot of resistance to changing the way that we've been managing livestock losses in the past, which I think is a bit sad because there are so many tools that landholders are using for livestock protection in other countries that would be applicable to many of the situations that we have in places like the ACT. So some of those tools might include using electric fencing, which is a really effective barrier to dingoes and a way of separating them from livestock. Also, the use of livestock guardian animals, whether that's dogs or donkeys, they can be really effective at protecting livestock from large predators. So farmers in Europe as well as in North America use livestock guardian dogs really effectively to protect small livestock. I guess there's also a conversation about the types of livestock that we're farming in different places. So the tool that you use to protect sheep is going to be different from the tool that you use to protect cattle. So we need to have evidence-based approaches to these, and we need to get some of this information to landholders. And I think that's one of the problems at the moment, is that it's not so much that landholders are resistant to having dingoes, it's that they don't have the tools to, or the information available to them about the sorts of tools that they can use that are not lethal control. And I think hopefully some of the work of people like Dr. Linda van Brommel would be really great to get in front of landholders about how to use livestock guardian dogs in places like the ACT, where because of the smaller size of the land holdings, that would be a really great tool.
So I think you've mentioned this, but is there any other sort of tools? So we had a question from Joe Clay about the best tools, non-lethal tools. I think you mentioned fencing, livestock guardian animals. Is there anything else that has been shown to be effective?
Yeah, so things like fladry can be effective for short-term things. So it's like a flag that you put on an existing fence that flaps in the wind, and it can be good to sort of deter predators for a short period of time. The problem with tools like that is if you put them up and leave them for a long time, then the predator will, get used to it and not be scared from it anymore. And there's other things that can be similar deterrents. Some researchers are looking at using different sounds. Lights can be effective sometimes, partly because they might just scare them, and that avoids them going to an area. There's some work using like a giant flappy man, like one of those car yard guys that's motion activated. There's scent marking that scientists are looking into at the moment, but really some of the really effective tools that we already have in place and we already know work from, overseas, livestock guardian dogs, electric fencing, even just normal fencing can help, like good barrier fencing, fladry, changing the way that you're doing animal husbandry. So if you have vulnerable livestock, particularly when they're going to be having young, putting them in internal paddocks away from predators, so closer to your home, or putting them in a protected shed or barn is an effective tool. But these sorts of things, like, it depends on the types of livestock you're running and the size of your property. So putting all of your ewes in a barn is not going to work for a landholder that's got hundreds of thousands of hectares, but to somebody who's got like 200 sheep, that might be something that they could do. So it's really about tailoring those tools.
I think we're going to have to wrap up there because I think we've run out of time. So I'm just going to put in the chat, if your question has been missed or you want some more information, I think there's also been some people who have reached out asking for some particular things around testing and other data that exists around the country. So If you want to just contact us with those questions, I'll just put in our email address and we can contact Kylie and James to follow up. So you've got that there. If your question was missed and you're really burning to ask that, we can do a follow-up if need be. But otherwise, can we please thank Kylie and James for the excellent presentations today.
Thank you for having us.
No, thanks so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. And yes, the webinar will be recorded and made available on the Conservation Council ACT YouTube page, and we'll send the link around to everyone who registered. Thanks
Great.
very much. See you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Bye.